U.S. History Summer School, let's pause for a second and talk about the abolitionist movement, because obviously the idea of abolishing slavery has been around since slavery has existed, right? We can talk about, colonial Quakers and that sort of thing, but the abolitionist movement that we know about, we're talking William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, that really explodes in kind of this Jacksonian era of the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. There are kind of three reasons why. So one, for context, there is a growing reform movement known as the Second Great Awakening. It's happening in the 1830s and 40s. It's kind of similar to the First Great Awakening that happened 100 years earlier. And it's just this idea that a lot of Protestant churches were looking around and realizing that this new United States was growing increasingly secular, especially as we've gone a few generations now into our kind of independent country, which, by the way, that's how the founders wanted it. But still, so we have this revival movement where you have kind of popular Christianity spreading throughout the country. It's including a lot of women for the first time in this process. And it's also encouraging people to apply all of their Christian values to like every aspect of their life, not just, what they say in the pews on Sunday. What a concept. Now, I'm going to talk way more about the women's movement in a few videos, I promise. But a lot of these women get really focused on the issue of abolition. The second big reason is that by the middle of the 1800s, the Black population, especially in urban areas, has reached this critical mass, whether those are descendants of free Black people or they are escaped enslaved people, freed enslaved people, whatever, that have made their way to the North, where now there is this infrastructure, thanks to things like William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, whatever, that can spread their voices and their stories around. Side note, by the 1830s, the abolitionist movement was clearly becoming successful because there was constant violence and debates in Congress where Southern states felt really threatened by the abolitionist movement, so much so that the House of Representatives actually passed a gag rule basically saying we are literally just not going to talk about slavery. We just can't do it or else we're all going to fall apart. Of course, that has to go out the window in 1848 when we have all this new territory, right? And we have to decide what to do with it. Go see my video on the Compromise of 1850. But that also means that people like Frederick Douglass can start printing up his newspaper, the North Star. He can go around on speaking tours by the late 1840s talking about his experience. Now, most cynically, I'm also going to argue that growing industrialization meant that a lot of Northern business interests who had supported slavery, even if they didn't own slaves, they understood that the U.S. economy ran on enslaved labor. Well, by the 1840s and 50s, industrialization is happening to the point that a lot of those business interests are I don't know, maybe the economy would be fine without it. So cynically, I would also argue we're getting to the point where maybe we didn't need enslaved labor as much as we felt like we had earlier. U.S. History Summer School. Okay, so we're marching towards the Civil War. We've been talking about sectionalism. We've been talking about the debates over slavery and the abolitionist movement, but I do want to pause for a second and just check in with the ladies. What's been going on with white women in the 19th century in the United States? Obviously, you can't sum up the experience of every even white woman for, 50 to 60 years, but in general, they went through kind of a few phases. First, in the wake of the American Revolution, a lot of women were rightfully disappointed that they hadn't been included in these new revolutionary ideas in the Constitution. Abigail Adams very famously wrote to her husband, "Remember the ladies," and he did not. But there was a small opening with this idea of Republican motherhood. Basically, the idea was, hey, if we're creating a democracy, or to the future haters in the comments, a democratic constitutional republic, then we need educated voters. And who's responsible for teaching and raising educated kids? Moms. So women were seen as very important to the functioning of the new government, and since they were the ones responsible for teaching and raising a new generation of educated, leaders, politicians, and voters, they themselves had to be at least mildly educated. Then in the 1810s, 20s, 30s, the US is going through a commercial revolution. This is sort of the precursor to full-scale industrialization, but it's the idea that, hey, I don't know, maybe Jefferson was wrong. Maybe we aren't going to be a nation of small subsistence farmers. Maybe our nation is going to revolve around trade and a larger economy. Whereas before, a lot of women, especially middle and upper class women, had some informal power as the managers of the home economy, where there was home, textile creation or farming. Now, a lot of that stuff is being handed over to bigger businesses and also growing industrialization. And so those middle and upper class women are left with more time on their hands. They've gotten some sort of basic education to be able to prepare the future generation of male leaders. And now they also have some time on their hands. And by the way, 1830s and 40s is when that Second Great Awakening was happening. If you remember from a previous video, this is basically reviving Protestant Christianity, trying to be more inclusive, a lot more women get involved. It's also encouraging Christians to really apply the teachings of the Bible to like every aspect of their life. And so this is going to be the spark for a lot of reform movements in the 1800s. The biggest and most important of those is obviously going to be the abolition of slavery, but we're also going to talk later about the temperance movement, and for some more radical women, women's suffrage. The thing I really want you to notice right now is that women are so good at this. Throughout time, women have very strategically pushed at the boundaries and the restrictions placed at them just very subtly to slowly expand their sphere of influence and get more power. So pay attention to my air quotes here, but I'm just a mother. That's my role. But so I need an education to be able to raise my children right. Or yes, I'm the weaker sex. I'm more nurturing and maternal. And so I can't just worry about just my kids. What about those poor enslaved children? It works, but it takes forever.